you, and good evening to some others of you who are joining us from various parts of the world. So we're very pleased to have you with us here today, and we're going to be talking about navigating stereotypes and unconscious bias in the workplace. Please note that we're saying navigating. We know that we can't get rid of stereotypes and we can't get rid of this unconscious bias, but what we are going to be looking at is a way in which we can thrive in a world where we are currently in a minority, but where we are looking forward to taking a greater place there, despite the unconscious bias and despite the stereotyping. So let's start by making the business case for women on boards. Women on boards bring higher returns on equity, they bring higher price book variations, they bring a superior stock price performance, and they bring higher dividend payout ratios. This is the business case, and as was mentioned in the introduction, what we are looking for is to make sure that the resources of women are expanded and that the businesses and organizations that we work with learn to use us in a better, more equitable way. We don't also bring better, higher business returns to boards. We also bring to the board diversity of thought. We bring better stakeholder representation, a competitive advantage, and the availability of essential skills. It's particularly this diversity of thought that is important, because there is this thing called collective intelligence. And in collective intelligence, we bring the best of what women have to offer, along with the best of what men have to offer. So we are operating 360 instead of just 180, as we think about some of the issues and some of the problems and some of the strategies and some of the opportunities that are coming the way for our businesses. So here's the fantasy. The fantasy is that we've been recognized. Our talents, our experience, our qualifications, what we have to offer has been recognized. The glass slipper fits. And if the fairy tale holds, what would happen would be that we would go off, dancing through lives, and we would live happily ever after. So the big issue, and the big wake-up call that comes to many of us, is the reality. And this is the reality that we stub our toes on. That's an excellent suggestion, Ms. Triggs. Perhaps one of the men here would like to make it. I cannot tell you how many women have said to me, this is exactly what happens to me. And this is a cartoon that was drawn in 1988. So this has been going on for a long time. In fact, what's happening is the wedding part was easy. You know, finding the Prince Charming, having the wedding, that was all the easy bit. Now comes the hard work. And the hard work comes of making the marriage work and of making sure also that we thrive in the process. Because in order for our organizations to thrive, we need to be able to thrive. It isn't just a one-person deal on this. We need to thrive, and therefore the organizations will thrive, despite the Ms. Triggs moments. So as we look at this time we have together, we're going to look at three sections. We're going to look at what is unconscious bias, exactly how does it take hold of our brains, and with all that potential to make our lives miserable. And what can we do to bring these biases into the daylight? How can we stop being ambushed and surprised by unconscious bias? What are these darn things? Secondly, we're going to look at how women manage to keep themselves centered, how they can use emotional intelligence to counter that drip, drip, drip of unconscious bias that happens all around us, the small comments, the stones that get in our shoes as we're moving along the pathway to success. So what does it mean to be centered, and how can we focus on that? And thirdly, we want to look at how we can work with other people, because the important thing that Lottie and I have learned in our Women on Boards workshops is that what women say to us time and time again, it's knowing that I'm not alone. It's knowing that others are also having these same difficulties. It's being able to pull on those resources that we have when we work together. So we're going to look at these three things as we go through this presentation. Let's start by defining unconscious bias. Unconscious bias happens outside of our control. It's those quick thoughts that go through our brains. It's those quick judgments. It's those quick assessments of people and situations. As we go through our days, we are inundated by information, and we cope with all this avalanche of new bites and information coming in with mechanisms in our brains that sort and categorize this incoming information. So it's this sorting and categorizing that comes under the rubric of unconscious bias. So that, for example, if someone's talking about a cab driver or a taxi driver, I, for one, will automatically assume, until told otherwise, we're talking about a man. That's the way my brain sorts this information. Cab driver, oh, man. And it happens very quickly. I'm not conscious and I'm not aware of making this assessment. If someone talks to me about a primary school teacher, my automatic reaction will be that we are talking about a woman until somebody says something different. It's this quick way of categorizing incoming information that operates inside our unconscious bias. However, a cab driver, thinking a cab driver is a man, thinking maybe a school teacher is, a primary school teacher is a woman, is not necessarily harmful. But there are some of these unconscious biases that can be harmful. There is a confirmation bias in support, which supports the favored belief is overvalued, while evidence to the contrary is discounted. One of the most common biases that women run up against is this bias of the belief that women are not good decision makers, the myth of the woman as a poor decision maker. In a confirmation bias mode, if you look at this picture, what you are seeing is a picture of a worried woman. You're seeing a woman struggling to make a decision. You're seeing a woman who is not a decision maker, a fast, steady decision maker. And in the world of decision making, that is king. That is king to be the decision maker. And as I was putting all of this together, I was laughing because in my head, even the language, it's the king who is the decision maker. The word king is embedded in my language. It's embedded in my thought of the top dog is king. So you can see how that unconscious bias functions all the time, as in the assessments, even in my head, sometimes the assessment is the decision maker is king. What the unconscious bias does is it discounts the interpretation that this woman is in fact carefully reflecting, weighing up her options, thinking through the consequences of her decision for the well-being of the business. So it's looking at this kind of unconscious bias and how it gets directed at women that we need to examine. So what's the source of unconscious bias? Behavioral economist David Kahneman, who's written his book, Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow, talks about the two cognitive processes that act in our brain. System one is fast, unconscious, automatic. It deals with everyday decisions and it's error-prone. So that, for example, in system one, if you were looking at that picture of the worried woman, it's very fast. It shoots up from the unconscious. She's worried. She's out of her depth. She's overwhelmed. It's automatic. It comes without conscious thought, and it's part of everyday decisions. So that if a man is sitting there thinking about, now, who can I go to ask for advice on this decision, his system one will say, go find the man, because the man is king of decision making. And it's error-prone, because in doing so, this person discounts what the women have to bring to the table. System two, that we will be looking at more closely later, is much slower than system one. It's conscious. The effort has been made to really realize, okay, what am I thinking here? It's effortful. it deals with complex decisions, and it's much more reliable because instead of just dealing with half the equation, half the knowledge, it's going down deeper to look at what really are some of the issues going on here. How do we use System 1? Well, one example maybe of using System 1, I don't know if it's ever happened to you that you've gone out to buy a winter coat, for example, and find yourself at home an hour later with a pair of wonderful high-heeled shoes that you just couldn't resist. We make these decisions very quickly with System 1, and afterwards we rationalize. We say, well, yes, you know, I can make do with the coat I've got at the moment, and besides which, these shoes were on sale. They were a bargain. And that happens all the time, that we use our System 1 to really, it takes over, and afterwards we rationalize with System 2. And that's what Kahneman points out, is that System 1 rules the roost. System 1 is the system that's in the driving seat, because it's very, very fast. And it's afterwards that we rationalize what our decision is. So that, for example, in an interview situation, you may have a male interviewer who interviews women and men for the job, and his System 1 is saying, go for the man. The man is like you, the man reminds you of when you were young, the man will fit in, the man will be easy. And it's afterwards that the System 2 kicks in to rationalize and say, he has the better qualifications, he came out better, he's more articulate, the clients will like him, he will fit in. So you see that System 1 and that System 2 operating unconsciously in our world, in the workplace. So let's take a closer look at this System 1, because this System 1 is very important and it drives a lot of the decisions that we make. System 1 is involuntary, it's automatic, and it's always on. It assesses information quickly and uses rules of thumb and snap judgments to deal with life's complexities. It's the source of unconscious bias. When we think of CEOs or board directors, System 1 supplies this mental picture, a consistent mental picture of what a CEO or a board director will look like. And the typical board director is most likely to be a man. So System 1 has this need for this internal consistency. It's fast, it's quick. And when we talk about a CEO, the mental image that comes to our head is not a woman, it's a man. And that probably explains a lot of the reasons why globally we know that only 4% of the CEOs of globally listed companies are women, and 96 of them are the men. And it's this mental image that abides and lives in our System 1 that continues to reinforce this bias against women. And it's a very, very powerful system. Let's look at some of those biases. There's the stability bias. Well, let's back up and say immediately that the System 1 and the biases are in favor of stability and they don't like change. System 1 doesn't like change. It considers change as disruptive and destabilizing. So in this stability bias, there is a certain inertia that takes over. It's easy. We don't want to do things differently. Any of those of you who have been in organizations that are restructuring will understand the disruptive environment and the disruptions that occur when you are restructuring. It usually means too much change, and System 1 doesn't like it. So a reluctance to recruit women to sit on boards or to promote more women to leadership positions comes from this bias towards stability, bias towards keeping things the way they are. You know, there's that thing that's saying, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So this is often what happens with boards. They're functioning well. They're used to each other, they're used to this system, and there is a reluctance to take women on board. Social biases is another one, where the social biases, it's where you have harmony over conflict, and you don't have the constructive criticism and questioning and challenging that goes on when you've got different people bringing up different points of view. So the old boy clubs where really people are very, very comfortable together, they've known each other for ages, their social life is also interconnected with their professional life. They're comfortable in those groups and they want those social biases. I think one of my favorite biases also is the availability bias. It is the unconscious expectation that women will be available. Now, my personal theory is that these women will not, the unconscious bias not only says that women will be available, it also says that they will listen. So I think it's the root of this thing that we find so annoying, that men allow themselves to interrupt women all the time. And I think it's their unconscious availability bias in action. They're saying, well, actually, she shouldn't be talking anyway. She should be listening to me. My expectation is that that woman will listen to me. So we are expected to be available, and it can be very, very irritating to be a recipient of all of those interruptions. Not only are we expected to be available to listen, I think we are also expected to be emotionally available. A lot of the research shows these days that when a company is in trouble, there is an opportunity that opens up for women to take over as CEOs. The figures show that a company in trouble, what they normally look for is a CEO with stereotypically womanly traits. Someone who is good with people, someone who is warm and who is a good communicator, someone who's tactful. Now, not all women have these traits, nor are all men devoid of these traits, but the unconscious System 1 associates these traits with women. You could basically say, System 1 is saying, when in trouble, run for mummy. When the company is doing well, dad will do, and we're looking for a leader who is forceful, ambitious, competitive, and these are all traits that we associate with men. It's a complex situation, so let's just take a quick look at what actually happens in our brains when we become the recipients of this unconscious bias. You can see at the bottom there you have the spinal cord, which is where the messages enter the brain. That's where we hear those comments. And then those messages go straight to the limbic system, which is the emotional area of the brain. So this is the area where you feel the results of what you have just heard. And it takes time it passes through the field, the limbic system, the feeling brain, into the executive brain where you think rationally. Now, what happens sometimes when you are a recipient of some of that unconscious bias? What happens is that your system gets flooded and the emotional brain takes over, and it stops the messages going over to the executive brain. There are some interesting examples of this flooding of the executive brain by the emotional brain. And I found them in a booklet that has been written by a group called the Male Champions of Change in Australia. It's an extraordinary organization, and I certainly do advise you to get on the internet and check out their systems. They talk about everyday sexism, and they have got some quotes in there that will flood your system, of your emotional system, will cause it to take over. One major assumption that they have targeted is the assumption that caring and careers don't go together. And so you hear women tell us that, as they did tell the Australians, they say, I was passed over to go to a conference because I was told that I have the children at home to take care of. And the man who was chosen in my place also has children at home that presumably his wife needs to take care of. And it's that kind of unconscious bias that can really throw you for a loop. They also link a second one, which is a preoccupation with physical appearance. The comment is made, I couldn't take her seriously during that presentation. Did you see what she was wearing? Well, these are the kind of things that can cut off your executive system. It really can get you going. Or the unwarranted gender labeling. I was told I needed to be less aggressive. These are the kind of things that make it really difficult sometimes for us to respond and not react. This, for example, is what happens, and I love this picture. It's a picture from the 1970s. It's in black and white. It's got that kind of film noir, aged, slightly threatening air about it. But I think even today, we recognize what is that basic situation. You walk into a room and you say, is this the right room? Do I belong here? And that constrains us. We have chosen to work in the business world, and our ability to perform well, to be high-performing members of a team, can be constrained by this feeling that we don't belong. It's hard to feel when you belong, that you belong when you are the only woman in the room, and when you sense your performance is being judged by male colleagues. Because of the traits like incompetent or irrational, they just hang in the air, and even though when they are not explicitly stated, you just walk into the room, you're the only woman there, and you feel it. And for us working in this man's world, any misstep or mistake leaves us feeling that we're running the risk of confirming a broader notion of women's inability to lead and to excel. What is happening here is that you are running into the bias of the in-group, and you are not in the in-group. And what is always interesting is that when men are told that they are benefiting from being members of the in-group, they don't realize it. They are stunned to realize that they have invisible privilege there, that they belong, and that if you were to complain to say, I don't feel as though I belong here, it's such a nebulous thing that the reaction often is, well, maybe you don't. And sometimes that's the question that we ask ourselves, and sometimes we think that these men are also saying to us, what is she doing here? Does she belong in this room? And it's a very uncomfortable, constraining feeling. What happens in that case is that you're being emotionally hijacked. Your emotional brain is taking over. Your system 1 is taking over. And the symptoms of an emotional hijack are a strong emotional reaction. Your heart starts beating faster. You feel your face getting flushed. It comes on suddenly. For me, it happens when I try to swallow. You know, when I really get uptight, it's the swallowing. Plus, I notice that my shoulders take off above my ears. So it's that whole tension that sets off. The good news is that there are ways to deal with this emotional hijack. An emotional hijack is the opposite of emotional intelligence, which is governed by System 2. You need to click into your emotional intelligence. And those of you who have worked with us on the Women's on Board workshops know the 4 categories of emotional intelligence: self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, awareness of others, and relationship management. So when you get into this emotional hijack, it's particularly that self-awareness and that emotional self-control that needs to kick in. Because your System 1 has distorted the situation, has brought a threat level up to an area where it is flooding you. Someone has lit a match in the room and you are reacting as though it's a 5-alarm fire warning. So we need to bring that under control, and we can do that with our System 2. So it definitely is important to know also what our System 2 is about. And System 2 is the conscious system. System 2 is conscious reasoning, it requires efforts, and it is controlled. When we allow System 1, the stereotypes of others when we allow the system one stereotypes to take over, we are economizing our cognitive effort. We need to stop that system one, and we need to make sure that we are taking charge of our automatic and unconscious repertoires. I'm not suggesting that you ignore those messages, those unconscious biases, especially if there's a work culture that seems to tolerate them inordinately. But when you know that these unconscious biases are part of the work, are part of the way in which we can organize our brains, it just brings things into perspective. So that little voice that's saying to you, no, I don't belong, no, you don't fit in, you just blew that completely, they are right. It's the system two that says, no, take no notice of that, you do belong, you do have a lot to contribute, they do need you, you are valuable to this organization. And it's also the same thing of when you get overwhelmed, like this seems to go on day after day. It's that system two that says, keep at it, we're going to get there. We've got a long way to go, but we are going to get there. It's almost as though I'm a gardener, for example. I love my garden in the summer. And I know that I'm gardening in the ground, and there are these weeds that keep coming up. I never get rid of the weeds, but I pay attention to those weeds and pull them up, because my focus needs to be on getting those great tomatoes growing, to getting on the lettuce growing, the spinach growing, the corn growing. That's what I'm focused on. But I'm also aware of the weeds, and I know that I need to control them. It's a question of responding, not reacting. It's a question of knowing that I can take control of this situation. I do have things to offer. And it's that system two, that executive brain, that we pull on in those conditions, those situations. So what are we talking about when we talk about successful women thriving on boards? What we've looked at here is we've talked about not being not being ambushed by unconscious bias. It's there. It won't go away. We can't eliminate it. But we can manage and control that self-defeating little voice in the head. And we can make sure that we don't get overwhelmed by a distorted threat of biases. Secondly, and this is most important, is that successful women who thrive on boards are centered. What do I mean by that? I mean that they are emotionally self-aware. They know where their triggers are. They know, and most importantly, they know what their values are. My meditation teacher gave me some very important instructions at one point. She said, Brenda, learn to sit down, shut up, and pay attention. And basically, it's a question of paying attention to what my guiding values are. So yes, I do get knocked off my perch every now and again, but I know what my guiding values are. I know what's important to me, and that those values that I have, things that are important also to the people I work with. So it really is keeping control of my values, which give a purpose and a meaningfulness to my work. When you work full-time, when you work 40 hours a week, it is important to have a job where you do feel that you are contributing, where you do know that there is meaningfulness going on. Our jobs and our work and what we do shapes our values, shapes our approaches. And it's important to be able to live them out in the workplace and to know for ourselves that we have achievements and that we have strengths and that we are doing good things. And the third thing is to know that we're not alone. The single strongest message, as I said before, that Lottie and I have heard from the workshops is, you're not alone. That the women that we worked with developed amazing alliances, friendships, connections that go on between women. They know how to celebrate together those small victories. And most importantly, they figure out how to sustain themselves and keep going. Because the way certainly is long, and this road of navigating the unconscious bias, excelling at the work we do in leadership, it takes time. It takes time. There is a marvelous African proverb that's written on the wall of the airport in Johannesburg. I don't know if any of you have seen it. It says, if you want to travel fast, travel alone. If you want to travel far, travel with others. And I think that's the message that we have received from all the women in the workshops. And one of those ways, the important ways also, I think, of diminishing those unconscious biases is to have role models and to have them visually around us so that to see for ourselves on the walls of our offices pictures of women who are succeeding. I recently gave a workshop in Central Asia, and I went into the training room, and there were pictures of past workshops, and I counted 12 pictures of men behind microphones talking to women who are all taking notes. Well, those kind of images have to go because they are sending out subliminal messages. We want messages of successful, thriving women. We want messages of women holding the microphone. We want messages of women talking to the world about their values and what they have to offer. And for me, Christine Lagarde, look at that face. This is a woman who is thriving. This is a woman who is loving her job. This is the important kind of image that we need to have on the walls of our offices so that they're sending a very, very important message. So I'd like to conclude this present part of the presentation by sharing with you these comments from Christine Lagarde. I believe that women bring about something in and of themselves that is more precautionary maybe, and more thoughtful about the future, and more concerned about the next generation and what we leave behind. And I also believe that diversity procures that element of second guessing, thinking through, and debating a bit more, which is propitious to better decision making. So thank you, Christine Lagarde, and I hope that you will carry that message from her in your hearts as you move forward, in your hearts and in your minds, and remember the strength of your system too. So what we would like to do now, what I would like to hear from you is, what are some of the things that you're going to start doing in terms of getting a handle on navigating unconscious bias? And what are the things you're going to stop doing, and what are the things that you are going to continue doing? For myself, when I think about some of the things that I'm going to start doing, as we're waiting to hear from you, one of the things that I'm going to start doing is I'm going to start looking from the things that I can start doing to learn about how social media and how this whole idea of social media can be used to weaken and to counteract some of the aspects of unconscious bias. And I think this is the part where I'm finding also the diversity of the groups that we're working with, the age diversity, is very, very helpful. It gives me the opportunity to share my experiences from my perspective, but it also gives me the opportunity to learn from the younger people in the group, the younger women in the group, about the power of this interdependence as they experience it, this support as they experience it through social media, through the chat groups that Lottie always engages with so much, and that where she shares with me the strength and the pleasure that it gives her. What are the things that I'm going to stop doing? I'm maybe going to stop that little voice in my head that says to myself all the time, I wonder if the men will approve of this. I wonder if the big boss. And the image that comes into my head are some of the males that I've worked with. So I'm going to start replacing that with thinking, I wonder what some of my other women friends, some of my peers will think of this. And then what are the things that I'm going to continue doing? I'm going to continue trying to live out that value of mine that I have that is really very much on my mind. It's the fairness. I think fairness is such an important value for me. It's trying to be fair to myself, as I go through my workday, trying to be fair to my family, making sure that they are also getting my attention, but also, you know, making sure that also professionally I'm being fair to the workplace. So it's those three levels of fairness that is something that I'm going to try and continue doing.
You do have some responses coming in. One person says, stop apologizing all the time, listen more and observe people's space as it shows the role they want to play in a room, and continue to interrupt when I am being interrupted.
I love it. I love it. And I think that question about stop apologizing, women use what we call ritual apologies. They don't mean I'm sorry. They mean this is something I'm rethinking. It's almost like a filler that we use in conversation. We'll begin by saying, I'm sorry, but. And for other women understand it, but the men take it as, oh, she's already apologizing. It weakens us sometimes in the eyes of the men. So I think stopping yourself from doing that is a very good thing to be doing.
Another person said respond instead of reacting.
Yes, it's that letting the system too go in, so keeping your poise. I mean, I think one of the big biases is that men will say, she's having a bad day. No, she's lost it. She's emotional. And that's the worst put down you can ever make, I think, for a woman, is she's so emotional. We don't say the same things about men, so it's that business of being known as somebody who responds, not somebody who reacts emotionally.
Getting more. Let's see. Engage system 2 as I consciously reason. Try to share more experiences of powerful women to improve our self-image. Speak more about good things about women and not much about our emotional bias.
Okay, that's interesting. What I have found is that I try to stop beginning my sentences with I feel that. This is, maybe it's my own sort of personal response to all of this. I try to make sure I start my sentences by saying, you know, if I'm in a room, I think that. And it's a small thing, but I just want to show that, you know, I've got a brain. Actually, I've got a very good brain. And I use my brain to think. It doesn't mean to say that I don't stop using my emotional intelligence, but I'm just aware of the fact that I am viewed as somebody who has this feminine trait of being communicative, of listening, of being available. And I just want to make it clear that, yes, I've got important thoughts to share, and that is my system 2 coming out there, that, you know, and even saying, not, it worries me that you're making that decision. It's the way of saying, shall we rethink that? I think there might be other ways to look at this So it's really trying to get this idea across system 2 is in control, and that's the image I want to project.
Let's see. Sorry, I'm trying to find them because there's a lot coming in. Thank you, Brenda. That was wonderful. The emotional ambush was a great and familiar experience for me. Start, I'm designing some BBLs with World Bank and IFC staff. I'm going to do a session on UB. Stop, unconscious bias. Stop second-guessing self. Trust my experience and judgment more. Continue saying thank you instead of sorry.
Very nice, very nice. And when you're going to give that session on unconscious bias, you've got my address, you've got Lottie's address, and afterwards when you get these slides, also you will see I've got a list of references that you might find useful. And I like the idea about saying thank you. I think that I think gratitude is such a lovely emotion. And it's, you know, if you think about the people that have helped us on our way, and if you think about your role models, and you think about the people who support you, as you're doing things, not just in the workplace but at home, that thank you changes everything. That thank you gives such a different sense of proportion and meaning to your life, and makes things, I think, so much more pleasant and so much easier to go forward.
Another one is, we'll stop shying away from networking with successful women who can be great mentors for me.
Yes, and I think, again, the research shows that, there's the myth of the queen bee, the woman who made it to the top and who is determined to keep that singular place for herself. And it is a myth, and there's Sheryl Sandberg and Adam Grant have written a very interesting article called The Myth of the Catty Woman. And it has been found in research that women are far more likely to mentor and to sponsor than men are. And that because we have this attitude of solidarity and paying forward. And those queen bees, you're not imagining it, they are out there. But it's often because, as Sheryl Sandberg shows in her article, it's because they're the only ones there. It's, again, we go back to this point of what we're trying to get is 33% of the leadership group need to be women to have a real strong impact. And it's because when you're on your own, it's isolating, and you tend to take on the culture of the people who are around you, which would be the boys-only group. And you also tend to not want to associate yourself as the minority with a less powerful group, which is the women coming up the chain. So we can understand what's happening in the brains of these queen bees, but they are in a minority, and don't let them be your only image of what a successful woman is.
This is an item, I think, to either start or continue. It says, saying thank you. I also use this when I'm late instead of sorry. For example, thanks for waiting for me.
Lovely. It's so elegant. It's so elegant. It really is.
An item to stop, feeling as though my views don't count in a meeting, and start to confidently put them out there.
Yes, and I think I'll go back to Christine Lagarde again. She's asked about, where she gets her confidence from, and she says, I prepare. So if you are going to make that intervention, you do need to know that you are a minority, and that people are watching you, and their system ones are active. So what Christine Lagarde says, and she says her very close friend Angela Merkel does the same thing, when she makes an intervention, she knows that she is prepared for it. And it's true, everybody will say we have to work twice as hard as men to get where they are. And that's absolutely true, there's no way around that. The joy of it is that if you're in the right job and if you're in the right place, you enjoy the preparation and you enjoy making those interventions. The other thing is to keep on making them, because as you keep on doing it, you get better and better. You get better and better. And if you've got a friend in the room, somebody who can give you constructive, positive feedback on your performance, that also helps.
Okay, I think that's all that we've received for this start, stop, and continue, but we have some questions coming in. So there is also a situation where some few women disregard other women for their quality or ability in the workplace. This may be due to fear of that woman with better potential or anything else that she has. And I think this makes it worse for women who feel disregarded by another woman. What should we do when we face this type of unconscious bias and inappropriately challenged by our women colleagues?
Yeah, I think that's that issue of the queen bee yes, and it is tricky. I think first of all it's being able to understand a little bit what the situation is, but also being able to understand that the day of the queen bee is over, in the sense that more and more of us, we are getting up to that critical mass, and when you get that critical mass, and when there are 3 women in the room, when there's that 33% in the room, it does shift things. It is also interesting that I think we have unconsciously higher expectations of other women, and we let men get away with things that we don't bring to anybody's attention. So it's also monitoring for ourselves and saying, okay, are we actually being fair here? So if you're going to critique that one woman who seems to be going against you, are we also looking at the men who are going against us? And be fair in assessing why it is where she is and what it is that is happening. And reflect. And I think it seems to me always that the best way in which I can deal with this kind of situation is to develop a relationship to the extent that is possible, but not to knock myself out. The first person I have to look after is for myself, and maybe in what I'm seeing in some of those women is to say, I must be careful I don't fall into that particular trap.
Another question. In your opinion, what should be the role of men addressing unconscious bias and stereotyping in the workplace, particularly in sectors that are male-dominated, such as IT or the extractive industries, for example?
I think what I have done with male colleagues of mine is put them in touch with the male champions of change in Australia. When it comes out of the mouths of men into the ears of men, there's an enormous difference. And I think what I love about the male champions of change in Australia is they have written the booklets. They have translated, for example, how do you take family-friendly policies, which nobody's going to disagree with, and translate them down into eradicating everyday sexism and making sure that women are being fairly treated in the workplace. And they have concrete examples of companies that have said, we have these policies and we now need to integrate these policies into our culture. So I think it's when men speak to men, and it's when I happen to know best the Australian group, but I know there are groups also in Brazil, and there are, I believe, chapters of the male champions of change in other parts of the world. The main point is that we can't do this on our own. We can't be wagging our fingers at the men all the time and saying, you've got to stop doing this, you've got to start taking notice of us. We need to do this together because, as I said right at the very beginning, it's the collective intelligence, it's the 360 thinking about how we are running our business that is so very important. So this is something we have to do in partnership with men.
Okay, one question. Do you have any recommendations for good unconscious bias awareness activities to do with teams?
There's a lovely kind of activity that you can do where you can list the unconscious bias. I think sometimes bringing that into the daylight, and then find the steps that you can take to weaken these unconscious bias, ones that will fit and work in your organization. There are no silver bullets. There's no pat format recipe for this. I think when you're dealing with unconscious bias, it needs to be done carefully so that you don't end up making the other people feel that they are being targeted or triggered, or it's something that does need to be done carefully. But in a team, if you can create a collegial atmosphere in which you can list some of the things that you consider to be the unconscious bias, and then move to the next step, which is, are we going to integrate this in our daily activities? And again, not to hammer on the point, but we are going to give you a list of references at the end. But I think what I like about the Australians is that they take it down to a day-by-day basis. And they also go back to always starting from, we are doing this because we want our business to perform better, because we want top performance out of everybody who is here. So it's not asking the men to advise us, but asking the men to work with us to find ways in which we can make this, our workplace, more inclusive and more comfortable for everybody. And not just the big policy decisions, but how it happens every day in the office, in the boardroom, with the idea of we're going to make our company better.
Okay, we have another question. How can we leverage and explain a professional gap where we did volunteer work and independent consulting and training to enhance the way men view us, as opposed to associate that work with women roles and traits or think we were just raising kids?
How do you deal with...
How can we leverage and explain a professional gap?
How can you leverage and explain that professional gap? That goes back to that careering and caring gap. And again, I think it's getting this idea that we bring all of ourselves. As I think if you go back to that quote of Christine Lagarde, there's something in and of themselves. The women bring something in and of themselves. It's that essence of what we bring to the workplace. And the essence is that we are both caring and we do have careers. So it's finding the success stories. It's finding the people the women who are succeeding, and looking at this question of how do they do that? How do they close that gap between family and between work? It's also, I think, a question of working in alliances. It's working with other women to see, not being taken by surprise by the question of what exactly do you bring, but reinforcing each other and saying to each other, giving each other the feedback of saying, this is what you're doing, this is the problem that we are tackling, and this is how we go about it together. I think it's where you're talking about closing the gap. It's where mentors and sponsors are so very important, because they can show us the way in which you do close those gaps. They are the ones who are at the top, they are the ones who are succeeding. And I think in the sponsoring, it comes back to that question of a mentor will advise, a sponsor advocates for you. And a sponsor will get something out of the relationship too. So it's almost as though the mentoring is the top-down, giving advice, helping the younger person coming up. But the sponsorship is a two-way street. And that's the beauty of that, is that I think the younger generation, the women coming up, have something to say to the people who are at the top of the company. It is very important to keep that highway open so that we really do have this idea about sharing the voices and listening to each other.
Okay.
So we have time for just one more question.
Yes. Women and men are exposed to unconscious bias and stereotyping in our daily lives, but when it comes to decision-making situations, do we need to become more like men to make our voices heard?
I don't think so. I think what I'm saying is, it seems to me in centering yourself, you have to be authentically who you are. And I think the idea that it is a myth, it's just a myth, it's just a type 1 stereotype, system 1 stereotype, that women can't make decisions. Of course we can make decisions. You think raising children can be done without being able to make decisions? Of course. You know, we run our homes, we run our lives. We operate corporate governance in the household. We can make decisions. And I think it's this business of putting down that idea and saying to ourselves, I'm centered, I've got my values, I have my capabilities, and man, am I a good decision maker. And having that right in front of you and having a picture of yourself, a mental picture of yourself. I am the decision maker that you project as you go about your daily work. You are a good decision maker. Don't let your system 1 or anybody else's system 1 say anything different. So I think that's our time.
Yes.
I would like to thank you all very much on behalf of Lottie and myself, and we really would like to thank all of those women who are part of the alumni of the Women on Boards. It has been a great joy, I think, to Lottie and I to learn with you and from you, and we hope to continue these webinars and Please give us your feedback. Please let us know how it worked. Please let us know what you would like to talk about and what are the issues that you would like to bring up and you would like to share. So these slides will be sent to you, and at the end there you have the list of references which you will be able to see. And so it just remains for me to say a very large thank you. It's been a pleasure to spend time with you all, and I wish you every success as you go about your day. Thank you.
Thank you. You can see on the screen there's a link to evaluate today's webinar. I also sent it in the chat. And in that evaluation, you can also provide us ideas for topics for next time. So thank you, Brenda, and thank you to everyone who joined.
Thank you.
Thank you.